And that's one of the most interesting features of the series, I think, is all the complications of blending, you know, the Norman, or not blending, but the continuing warfare, although not overt so much, between the Normans who've come in and conquered and the Anglo-Saxons who are there, and then you've got the Welsh. You haven't, I don't know if you'll venture to Scotland, but, you know, all these, we don't think of England so much as a multicultural, multiracial society, but it certainly was.
Oh, it was, and of course,
after the conquest.
The moment you got above a certain level, beyond the Trent, you were into what used to be the Danish area. So you had an Anglo-Danish aristocracy, so when they go to York, for instance, you notice all the names are Danish names.
Absolutely.
And the moment they go to the east, which was another Danish area that was part of Danelaw, the moment you get to parts of Essex, but certainly further north when you get to Sussex and Lincolnshire, then nearly all the major names of the towns, as well as the individuals, tend to be Danish.
One of the things also that I really enjoy in this series is that you have an opportunity to explore, I don't know if I'd call it business exactly, but certainly in The Wolves of Savernake you deal with coinage, somebody who has a mint.
That's right. And
falsifying coins. In The Dragons of Arkenfield we have beer and brewery. Right. The woman who becomes a love interest is, she's the widow, isn't she, of a brewer?
Yes, she's the widow of a brewer.
And so she's kind of keeping the family business going. And so it's fascinating to read these vignettes of commercial life and so forth at this time.
It depends how you look at the Norman conquest. There are two views, obviously. The one view is, if you happen to come from Normandy or from France, that the Saxon culture was a dreadful thing, that the church was in decay, that it was an appalling place, and the Normans did England a favour by invading it and basically buffing it up into shape. The other point of view, which a lot of English historians take, is that actually Anglo-Saxon culture was a high point of medieval literature, as it were, and that the Normans came over and ruined it. I think the truth is between the two. The Normans brought good things, but William the Conqueror was extremely astute. He never threw anything away that he could use. And when he came in, he saw a taxation system was vastly better than his own. He kept it. And when he saw a coinage system which was vastly better than his own, with a system of mints, all of which were licensed, he kept that, because Edward the Confessor's coinage is one of the glories of that period. And that's why I use that, because we know from the returns that Edward himself kept the names of all the moneyers and the people who operated the mints, the minters in areas. And in a tiny little place like Bedwin, which I used in The Wolves of Savernake, there were two, one in Marlborough and two in that part of Wiltshire. And they were given the right to stamp the coin. The dies were issued from London, but they stamped them. And that, as you know, is part and parcel of the story.
And a wonderful opportunity for fraud.
Sure.
Then in the fourth book, The Lions of the North, you go to Yorkshire, where we discovered that there is a gentleman who actually keeps a zoo. I mean, they're real lions.
For sure.
So that's wonderful. And then you go to Canterbury to Kent.
That's right.
For the Serpents of Harbledown. And you yourself live in Faversham, which is not too far distant from Canterbury.
It's 8 miles from Canterbury, and every time I go to Canterbury, I drive over Harbledown Hill. Harbledown Hill, I always think of the 4 knights who came to kill poor old Tom Becket, because they came over Harbledown Hill, took one look at the cathedral on Christmas Day, and down they came and bumped him off. And at the top of that hill, because it's high and therefore above the disease-ridden city that it was in medieval times, Canterbury, they built a lepers hospital. A, because there was clean air up there. It's also the place where the Archbishop of Canterbury lived, and the leper hospital is still there. And it seemed to me it was a wonderful way to use Harbledown historically, as it were, in the story. I have a young girl who is a herb gatherer and who helps to bring the herbs which are used to alleviate the lepers in the hospital, which of course is run by monks from the Canterbury Cathedral. And she is murdered, and therefore we have a connection between Canterbury and the hospital, as it were, the lepers hospital. And then that story revolves right around the whole area. It takes in the fact that the stone which is built, out of which Canterbury Cathedral is built, is brought from Caen on a boat. And of course one of the men who brings the boat across is the father of the young girl who's been killed. So I'm able to kind of work that in as another theme. And because I live in Faversham, as you know, Barbara, I couldn't resist taking them to Faversham at one point, where they had salt pans. So I actually used the salt pans that were there as an element in the story.
It was wonderful. I really enjoyed our little tour this summer where we went over the ground, so to speak. And in fact, speaking of Faversham, in your Elizabethan series, there was a famous murder in Faversham at Arden, the merchant,
That's right.
whose wife and lover hired two totally inept thugs to murder him, and was the basis of a famous play called Arden of Faversham.
Arden of Faversham is one of the best plays ever written in the Elizabethan period. The problem is we don't know who wrote it. Sometimes people think Shakespeare really is so good. Psychologically, it's superb. It's got some of the best psychological motivation of that period. It's largely written in prose, and it's based, as you say, on a murder of Thomas Arden, who was the mayor of Faversham way back in the 1550s. And he was murdered by his wife and wife's lover. And it was a strange story because, as you say, they hired two of the most ridiculous hitmen possible, called Black Will and Shakebag. And they had 3 goes at bumping him off, and each time something went wrong. I mean, on one occasion, which you see they're in a fair, and as they try to come round a booth, some part of the booth falls on them, and they actually miss him. And they killed him in the winter in the house, which is still there, exactly as it was, Arden of Faversham's house in Abbey Street. I usually park my car outside there when I go to the post office. They murdered him in the house, and the wife and the lover also stabbed him. They dragged the body across Abbey Fields, leaving a trail of mud which meant that they could be followed, and they were all arrested. And this was one of the great sensational murders of the period, and it was recorded in ballads. So even 30 and 40 years later, when it became the source of a play, that play was a bestseller. When it just went on and on and on, people kept doing it. They went along to see this. And I use that, as you know, as the basis of The Roaring Boy, except that I turned the whole thing on its head in ways which I won't spoil the story by talking about now. But that was the basis of it, of a family murder, which was so scandalous. It was the perfect sort of triangular murder, if you like, you know, the husband, the lover, and whatever. Thomas Arden was immensely rich, of course, and the wife stood to inherit. She and the lover would have come in for an enormous amount of money.
It's certainly fun to be able to actually live. I mean, I think it's marvelous to live in an area. Kent certainly is enormously rich historically, or a country such as England, where plots absolutely leap up around you.
The plots leap, and the great thing about history is it doesn't date, Barbara, as you know, whereas you see, if you look at Bullet Hole, when I wrote that, I used exactly the figures that were available then for the number of people coming to see the thing, the amount of prize money. Now, the prize money in 1984 would not get Nick Faldo out of bed today. I mean, it has gone up so much more. Golfers can make $1 million at least. Absolutely, the Wrightson thing. Therefore, it looks terribly dated. So I've learned in contemporary writing never to tie myself down to figures. Always to be fairly kind of amorphous when you're saying, you know, it's $1 million hoist or whatever. That doesn't, you know, you don't pin it down.
But even though you live where historical mysteries, plots and so forth suggest themselves, you wrote 2 other sports mysteries fairly recently under still another pseudonym, Martin Inigo. Yeah. And one of them, you said, was suggested by the view from your own bathroom or attic window at Corley Hall, where you could see a golf course and say one of them is a golf mystery.
Yes, what happened there was we lived on a farm in an old place called Corley Hall in Warwickshire. And up in the attic, which was an attic and nothing else but that, I had a wonderful view out over my neighbour's farm. And he had what we call, I can't imagine you have them over here, a slurry lagoon, which is a square bank, if you like, covering a quarter of an acre, into which all the effluent from the farm is channeled with water, and then it evaporates. And it saves having a mains drain. Obviously, it's much cheaper. And it was a council tenancy, and the council came and dug this one day. And I was up in the attic one day cleaning away and looked down into this lagoon, and I just thought, what would happen if a man's hand were sticking out of that lagoon with a golf ball there? And that was the image I began with. And as it happened, within, 15 miles away, the Belfry Golf Course is there, which of course is the head of the British Professional Golfers Association and the venue for many years for the British end of the Ryder Cup. So I brought my protagonist along, and I turned my own house into a hotel. I turned my neighbour into one of the characters in the story. I had my neighbour coming and staying in that very attic and seeing that same golf ball in the hand and getting involved in a story which led all the way down to the Ryder Cup. And it allowed me to balance the two. Now, the extraordinary thing about this, Barbara, you know, is that this must have been prescience of we hadn't met at the stage I wrote that book. And the man that I had as my villain, who was called Mr. Stone, the novel is called Stone Dead, in fact, which, as you know, is a technical term in golf. Mr. Stone happened to come from Glendale, which is Arizona. So even then, I was obviously looking towards Arizona as a kind of place I would move to eventually.